shoulders. So, Ben, thank you for joining. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks. Thanks a lot for having me on, inviting me on here.
No problem. No, I'm looking forward to it. So whereabout are you at the moment?
I'm in HQ for Athletic Shoulders, which is my home office in Surrey, not far from London. And yeah, it's a good day. I've walked the dogs, and it's a podcast day today. I've got my own podcast, as you know, that I'll be running an episode on later. But yeah, podcast and admin day.
Great. Who can you say who you've got on? This isn't going to go out for a few weeks. Not that it.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to having Raf Brandon on the show, and one of my ex English Institute of Sport colleagues from back in the golden era of English Institute of Sport practitioners. So Raf is going to be a really interesting episode.
Brilliant. How are you finding doing the podcast?
Well, it's been brilliant. I wanted to set something up, and fortunately bumped into a guy called Andy McDonald, who has been a brilliant host. He's definitely the face of the podcast and the voice, and I'm just sitting in the background, like holding on to his coattails. And the two of us have just got a few episodes done, and we're over 150 now over the last couple of years. And just trying to get stuff out there to the community, different variety of people and practitioners that might help others who are looking to share info. And it's built a big network for myself and Andy by just doing it. So it's been great.
That's brilliant. I had seen you've had some really interesting people. I saw you've had Darcy Norman on, who's a top guy.
Yeah. Darcy was a great person to talk to. Again, he was a friend of a friend of mine. And that's how it works. We just try and look for people who are recommended, so that we can get on the kind of people that you want to hear from. And selfishly, actually, most of the guests are all people I want to listen to. So yeah,
it's great, isn't it? It's a great way of doing it. You just get to contact people, and normally everyone's like, they're all keen to do it. That's what I found. Like, similar with you, it's really good, and you just have a chat with these people about stuff. Like with Darcy was an interesting one. So I met him in Germany at a trade show probably about 12 years ago, and he just started at Bayern Munich. And he was telling us about what they got there, where they gave him the Audi catalogue and said, right, which car do you want? Turned up in the full branded, all this stuff. And I'm like, oh my God, that was impressive.
Yeah, Darcy's as you probably well know now, he's got a really nice mixed portfolio of stuff that he does. And so he's done the graft, I think, in the trenches, working with those bigger teams in Germany, and then he's now diversified quite a lot, and is I think he's, as far as you can, shifted work-life balance towards a little bit back towards life, and away from the graft. But yeah, he's a really interesting character, and obviously hugely experienced. So it's great to have him on.
Definitely. So in terms of you then, how did you get involved in the area of physio?
Well, it's I qualified in 1997, so it's couple of decades ago. And the initial thing was I kind of fell into it, if I'm honest. And it wasn't some romantic story where I'd wanted to be a physio because I'd had an injury since I was 15. I'd never been injured, playing every sport under the sun. So there's really no link to it, other than that the school I went to, I was doing sciences and playing a lot of sport. And the two of those seemed to be, it's a choice of going for a gap year and mincing around for a year doing nothing, or getting into it. And I just fell into physio and loved it. And that was, going through my hospital rotations, so 2 years or 18 months in the NHS, then occupational health for 3 years. But I always wanted to get into sport. So as I realised I couldn't play sport at the high level I wanted to anymore, that was when I sort of gave up stuff and started to look for a career in sport as a physiotherapist.
So what was it about physio that you liked then?
I think it's the problem solving. When it comes down to it, it's the problem solving aspect of it is the thing that I enjoy. So, and that covers a huge breadth of stuff, from being a physio to being someone who might be in charge of a team. And I think that's the thing that drives me. And that's a one-to-one client, or that's a, solving a problem around injury risk in a team or organization, or however you look at it. It's all around problem solving, and that's where I think the interest lies for me.
And so how, going into occupational health, I've worked for companies that are involved in that. How did you find that as quite early on in your career?
Well, the opportunity there was brilliant. So I'd done my sort of rotations and I tried to focus them very much on orthopedics outpatients, but I'd done my time in intensive care units and neurological patients as well, which I think gives you quite a nice breadth and a grounding. But in all honesty, there are better people at me and people more passionate at me in those circles who have gone on to do brilliant careers in that area. And that wasn't something I was passionate about. So, I think when it comes down to it, the occupational health side was just huge population of people between the age of 18 and 55. Most of them were working on cars, so it was Land Rover vehicles in Solihull in Birmingham, big plants building Land Rovers, and so there were guys who were out there playing rugby every weekend, playing football, Sunday league stuff, coming in with sports injuries, and then there were other people coming in with chronic backs, others with acute, upper limb related overuse injuries, and so there was this again problem solving. It's like, well, we've got this workforce, we've got to keep them healthy. So there was a preventative aspect to that, as well as the reactive 20 patients a day, 5 days a week, trying to keep the workforce going. And it was brilliant. I mean, we had 3 of us there, all musculoskeletal physios bouncing off each other, very open environment, and also a lot of funding for education. So I got through a bucket load of courses. All the ones that I needed to do, like acupuncture, injection therapy, all these extra strings to my bow, were funded by the organisation as I was there and developed over a 3-year period. So it's a brilliant learning experience without the sort of necessarily the high stakes of being in an elite sport environment.
Yeah, do you think that's changed in terms of the investment in like staff and so on in these big organisations?
I can only speak from my own experiences. Everywhere I've been, there's been a budget for personal development. And I mean, sometimes that's a sort of deal sweetener when, the salary isn't perhaps maybe as high as you'd want it, but there's this extra added value and the whole package includes personal development. And I think some organizations, they have a budget. So they're restricted in terms of what they can pay you physically, but the added value is, the opportunity to develop yourself. And so for me, I've been really lucky. I've always had a development budget, as long as I can justify why I'm going to go and do these things, and also the giving back to the department. So if you go away and you do a course and we fund it, come back and, share that information with the team. And that's, I think, something that, every organization should be looking to do.
Yeah, it's definitely a good philosophy. You'd think it would be. It makes sense, doesn't it, to kind of grow and develop things. So, at what point did you decide to move on from there?
Came to a sort of natural conclusion. I mean, I'd been up in Birmingham. I did my undergraduate degree there, so my BSc, and then 3 years there in Birmingham, then 5 years after that living up there. And I was from sort of North London, Hertfordshire. So I wanted to move back home towards London anyway. And a job came up, an advert came up at Wasps Rugby Club for an academy physio position, a squad academy physio position. And I applied and I got it. So, that was fantastic. I'd applied for a couple of other, jobs. There was a job the year before at Gloucester Rugby. I didn't get that. In fact, I passed it on to a friend because it was a little bit more experience needed and he was in a better position than I was. So these opportunities were coming, but this Wasps one was perfect for me, going back down to London from Birmingham, and also, the sport that I loved, rugby. And so to get the sort of first foot on the rung of the ladder of elite sport was incredible.
Yeah, was your interest in the shoulder, like, had that come to the fore at that point?
Not at all, actually. I mean, of course, you've been exposed to shoulder injuries. overuse stuff in occupational health. But yeah, I was a generalist, and I'd still maintain I'm not a bad generalist now, given the experiences I've had. But no, that wasn't really the time when I started to focus in on shoulders per se. But of course we had contact collision, and all of those bits and pieces. So I suppose maybe it was seeing me and I wasn't seeing it at the time, but definitely those experiences would have set me up pretty well for when I did start to focus in a bit more on shoulders.
And how did you find that change in environment going from occupational health or straight into elite sport?
I had, I think it's a giant leap. It's a giant leap. And I think the lesson was, if you know the game, you think you're going to be okay going into the sport, and you probably make too many assumptions. So I think I probably wasn't as open to learning about the physio and support aspects of working with a rugby team, and I say that because you feel like you know the game, you feel like you know what's going on, so you perhaps don't pay as much attention, you assume quite a lot of things, and you probably don't ask so many questions. So I think I turned up there, was a pretty well qualified physio, but with zero sports experience, not a lot of sports science background, really no strength and conditioning type understanding, working with these guys who were the next level elite performers. And suppose over the 3 years then, by an organic process, working in and around some really top level strength and conditioning coaches, my boss who was there as a mentor, the first team physio, you learn, don't you? And the beauty of it was I started with the academy, so again the spotlight's not on you as much as with the first team. And eventually I moved and transitioned through the club to be able to help and support the first team over those 3 years. But yeah, it's a steep learning curve.
But did you feel like, quite a few people have said that they did think that they knew more than they did, and then you walk in and it's like, what am I doing here? Like, what do I do?
Yeah, 100%, smack in the face. I've always been relatively confident in my own abilities, and perhaps as you say, you sort of feel like you know more than you actually do. And then over time, and I think as we all get a bit older, we understand that we really know very little. And there's a lot more to learn. And then the other thing is, it's quite difficult. You go into that environment, you want to prove yourself. So you perhaps don't ask for help as much. You don't want to tell people you don't know. So you're seeing something, going home that night, furiously reading about it to come in the next day so you're ready and prepared, so that people don't know that you don't know. But that's normal, isn't it? I mean, I remember turning up, and we'll probably go into it, but I remember turning up at Arsenal, and the first few weeks, I'm not a bad physio at the time, pretty experienced, but going into a football club, you just don't know the normal ways of working. And then 6 months later, you look back and it's normal. So I think it takes about that time, somewhere around 6 months, to really embed yourself in any new environment.
Was it Doug the head physio then, or is he?
So at Wasps,
Yeah,
it was a guy called Roger Nibbs, and Roger had been there for a long time. He'd worked his way through from academy up to first team, but he was a great mentor, a good person. And there was just the two of us for two squads. So it's pretty intensive. Certainly not a 9-to-5 job, but it was brilliant, great experience.
Yeah, and then I know that you were working with. Did EIS come next after that?
Well, I went so after Wasps, and I think I was probably ahead of myself a bit, and I felt like I needed to move up, and I wasn't going anywhere because Roger was there. And I think at that point it was like, well, what else is out there? And there was a job at the Olympic Institute in Harrow at the time, and I did a job share with a colleague, Paul Thorley, and we were working with residential rehabilitation. We were seeing athletes from summer and winter sports. That introduced me to sort of the English Institute of Sport network, doctors like Mike Loosemore and other people. And then a job came up to lead the London team. So EIS started officially in 2007. and I was there as the lead physio in London, working with in charge of the London team, not the whole EIS physios, up to London 2012 games. Yeah.
What was that like then? That must have been pretty incredible time.
Yeah, amazing. Like I said earlier, I'm on with Raf later, so he was one of the UK athletics practitioners there. You had, just a wish list of people you'd want to work with. James Moore, Mark Young, people who don't know them at the time, they were right at the top of the game, and they were part of my team, and I had to try and lead them, which was, they'd probably give a different answer as to what value I added to them, but I tried my best to basically stay out of their way for a few years and just help them do what they did. But the experience is incredible. The network at EIS and the opportunity to work with that level of athlete in Olympic cycles was great. And as I say, I was kind of leading the team, so there was a part administrative role, but then I was seeing some rowers and I was seeing some track and field people. I was going away with some teams and still doing my clinical bit. But I really wanted to get my teeth into something. So one of my staff left EIS from British Judo, went to Leicester Tigers. He was offered a job and took the role up there. And that left judo open to me 3 years out from the Olympic Games. And I just said, right, I'd love to do that. And that's when I ended up being, basically almost full-time judo physio, whilst still trying to maintain that kind of lead role in London for the EIS.
So judo's based in Manchester now. Is it Birmingham or where?
Yeah, judo's based in Walsall now, I believe.
Walsall, that's right, yeah.
That's it. It was a high performance centre that they decided to centralise. But at the time, they were based at Dartford. So the British Judo Performance Institute was in Dartford, but then we had a load of satellite hub sites. So we had Edinburgh, Bath, Camberley, and then some others. But most of the athletes that were on the British team were at those other three centres in Dartford. So it was really a case of being in charge of what we did locally and then catching up with everybody when we went on European competitions and training camps or world comps and training camps. But then quality assuring what was fed into the director of performance for judo and the head coaches so that they can make selection decisions. And that's really where I started to sort of manage really an athletic program as a physio as part of my role, and took on a bit more responsibility for things like injury prevention processes, profiling and development, and actually did it myself rather than work on the team to help other people to do that with, say, fencing or women's rugby or track and field. Now I was in charge of a system myself, so I could test things out, make mistakes, learn and develop a bit of an own philosophy.
How big was the team there?
In terms of the judo team, we had probably 27 athletes on a program across all these different hubs. But, we had a kind of ranking of level of athlete based on world rankings. So we probably had a top 14 at the time to focus attention on. But then we also had their training partners. So, you can't say, right, you're not on the program, you're not on funding, when they directly influence the person who's in that top 14 training to try and win an Olympic medal. So we bent the rules a little bit to see whoever we could to help them out on that 3-year journey.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? Because you need people to fight against or to compete against.
Yeah, you do. It is an interesting dynamic. And then they've got sometimes the individual coaches externally. A lot of the training might be done during the week, so it's quite difficult when the program's not centralized. But we made it work best we could, given the resources we had available, the people we had available, and that was decent level of communication, setting up regular meetings, actually going to Edinburgh, going to Bath, going to Camberley to meet with the coaches and understand the issues that they were seeing with some of the key players.
What is the dynamic of that? Because you've got, say, in football, obviously there's thousands of people that are able to be there, but within judo, small sport, not much funding, it's competitive, I guess.
Yeah, really competitive. I suppose from an athlete perspective, it's all about gaining ranking points, and however you can get there. If you can compete and get yourself to a competition and win, you'll get yourself on funding, right? But from a support network, sometimes even Camberley wouldn't have had full-time physio access for a number of elite level players that weren't on the squad. So they'd have to either come to Dartford to see me if they couldn't get access there, or sometimes we'd use the IIU in Bisham and some of the practitioners there. So we could tap into services around the network if necessary to support what we were able to deliver. But we had a part-time doc on a Tuesday afternoon who sometimes travelled to competitions, mainly the major competitions that were nice in the nice venues. But we had a very skeleton service. We had a part-time nutritionist, we had a full-time S&C coach, but shoestring budget, as you say, and a difficult, scalable support service that you had to offer in a very different way to what you'd see when you go to the places where you have the bigger budgets, higher resources.
Well, what's that like for you as a practitioner? So you're leading this service, you want to do the best for who you're looking after, but then comparing that to, say, football, which I'm sure is also very difficult, but there must be very different challenges.
Yeah, if I sort of talk about the transition from English Institute of Sport, where we had, low budget, but I would say thought processes through the roof and a huge network of people to call on. So it didn't matter if you were doing it on a pen and paper basis, and as long as you were recording the things that mattered to make decisions, to feed back the information to the athletes, to the coaches, then it didn't matter if you were doing it on an Excel spreadsheet with an iPhone app and you were using what you had. But then you go to a place where you've got the bells and whistles like Arsenal, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're performing at a better level. It's all about the thought process and the human factor and the filter of the information and how you present that to make the decision. So I think sometimes there's a risk that you measure stuff that you can, because you measure stuff for measuring's sake. You've got all the equipment, you've got all the data. But my lesson learned probably was that, how do you measure the things that matter, regardless of what you use as a tool? And then the last thing is making sure it has an impact. So, there's maybe a bucket load of data in these organizations, and baseball organizations, there's huge amounts of information, but what do you filter to make the decisions? And that's not about technology, that's about good conversations, problem solving. It comes back to problem solving with, and more importantly, problem solving including all of the stakeholders that need to be involved in those decisions.
I think that's it, isn't it? Sometimes, like with some of the kit that we work with Omids up in Hope, it's like you can get so many data points, you can test so many things, but it's like, well, then what do we do with it? Like, that actually gives you more of a headache. Who's going to analyze it? How do you pull it all together? I saw you'd done a course at Cambridge University on like data analytics. So has that been a helpful thing to do?
Yeah, that was a sort of personal development thing. I felt like I'd done, enough formal education in the sort of technical aspects of what I was doing, and had the, physio and strength and conditioning support formally. And it was in lockdown, actually. So I was twiddling my thumbs, wondering what to do myself, and thought I need to understand. And it was largely about using data and understanding all these new tools that were coming out around kind of AI, and how you were helping to use that, make decisions, and filtering that information, understanding things like confirmation bias and all of the background behind it. So it was a certificate, and it was also working with people who weren't in elite sport. It was a worldwide cohort of diverse people working in business. So there was opportunity to share with a different community, to problem solve in a different way, and to think differently. And I think that was something I was looking for at the time. So it was really great to explore that at the point where I was actually coming into kind of managing data and systems and making those kind of higher level decisions.
Yeah, it looks really interesting. That would you recommend it? I'm always keen for CPD and professional development.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where the timing was perfect. I think now I wouldn't have the bandwidth for it, but I knew that I had an open 3 to 4 months where I could really dig into that. And at the same time, I was trying to set up some systems which required a better understanding of analytics. And so that was perfect timing and a really good level of content. You know, and it was a certificate, so it's not sort of a formal master's level, like master's qualification, but for that 3 to 4 month block, I think something like that is really useful if you're thinking of leading a team and you're starting to work with data and systems.
Which pretty much everyone is now, isn't it? Data is just what everyone talks about.
Yeah, and it was more the interpretation and the filter aspect of it rather than the technical, you know, learning R or programming or coding. And I feel like I'd love to have done that, but at this point in my life now, it's like, well, I can learn a little bit around that. I can teach myself Power BI. I can teach myself a few little bits, but ultimately, it takes me 4 times the time to do something that I can just get someone much better than me to do in about, you know, in a quarter of the time. So yeah, that's where I'm at with data science and data analytics.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a good place to be. So for the role at EIS then, so what made that come to an end?
The opportunity to work. Well, actually, funnily enough, it was Raf Brandon was doing some coaching development at the time, and I would say his guinea pig, but it was really useful. So Raf and I used to meet, and he would basically just use a lot of coaching questions. And one of the questions he asked me 6 months, maybe 9 months before the Olympic Games, which was a career ambition. So to go to the Olympic Games with a team. He said, well, what are you going to be doing in July 2012? And I said, I'm going to be preparing the last couple of weeks before the London Olympics. So what are you going to be doing in August 2012? I said, well, I'm going on holiday. And he said, well, where will you be working? I said, I'm not going to be working with EIS or British Judo. He said, well, you've only got 9 months to get a new job then. At which point, a bit of a smack in the face, the urgency picked up, and I probably looked around a few adverts, and that week there was an Arsenal job, first team physio, going in the you know, adverts, which is uncommon. Most of those jobs have already gone, right? Someone's got the job. They might advertise it word of mouth, but it's gone. But this was a genuine open advert to try and capture whoever. And so that was a process. I really didn't think I was going to get a chance because I wasn't from football. And then I got shortlisted. And then the rest, I suppose, is history. It went from 10 to 3 and went from 3 to 1. And then it went from 1 with no guarantee you got the job until you'd met Arsene Wenger. So that was one of the sort of, I suppose, scariest moments of my career, knowing that I was the you know, the recommended candidate, but I still had to pass the litmus test with this guy who was hugely famous, and at that point it was probably the most famous figure I'd ever had to deal with.
Yeah, what would that be like then? That's I'll come back to the actual interview, but just like me, what does he ask you?
Well, I think it's almost done. It's a done deal. You know, the Colin Lewin, my boss, and Gary O'Driscoll, the doctor, took me into the interview room, or to Arsene Wenger's office at the club. And as I said, it was 97% certain I'd get the job. I think that there was various between 96 and 99. I think 97 was where I sat with it. So there was still a 3% chance he'd say no. And for those people who've been fortunate enough to work with Arsene, he likes a long silence. So it was quite awkward, but we hit on judo as being a sort of shared area of interest because French judo is pretty high level, and we spoke about one of their top heavyweights and Olympic champions. And I don't know whether he saw the sort of benefits of maybe robustness in that one conversation of, like, athletes fighting, and this guy's managed to keep them relatively on the track. Maybe it's going to help with some of the injuries that we've got. I don't know. But I think it was just important that he got that opportunity, as he does with everybody that comes through the door, to veto the kind of characters that he wants involved in the team. And after 3 months, his comments to my boss after my probationary period were, I see Ben, but I don't hear Ben. And that was a positive affirmation that I was doing stuff, but I wasn't shouting from the rooftops about it. And that's the kind of character he liked. So perfect, job done.
Yeah, no, sounds like it. And then for getting the job, why do you think you got the job from the medical team then?
They were looking for, they were looking for people who could support it. There's no sort of problem with talking about it. Arsenal had a reasonable injury history, and that there's various reasons behind that. It was well publicised in the media. And I think largely that was around this kind of robustness, resilience, for want of a better term for it. So a physio who'd worked with fighters and rugby players and looked at setting up injury prevention and monitoring systems was quite attractive to them. They also employed at the same time, the guy who also was employed at the same time as me was from rugby, Dec Lynch. And then they already had Simon Harland, who'd worked with Irish rugby. Gary O'Driscoll, the doctor, was from Irish rugby and British Lions rugby. So it was looking out there for someone who could add value. And I think Colin's vision was, who are the best people to come in and help solve this injury problem? And also longer term, who's going to be able to put stuff in place and programs in place that are going to mitigate against injury risk, and probably make people a little bit more resilient than they'd had in the past.
Did you have a specific role to look at setting up those sort of plans then?
I did, after I convinced Colin that was necessary, after about 3 years of being in the job. But for about 3 years, I sort of felt my way. I did the rehabs that came my way. I was very much a rehab physio rather than a pitch side physio. And we just got our heads down 6+1 days a week and just worked with the injured players and tried to get them back. But of course, then you're seeing sometimes the same people come back to you, sometimes with the same injury, not always, but with other maybe related things to perhaps a lack of core strength or a lack of lower limb strength. And then when they start to come back, you start to see, well, actually, we're also looking at some monitoring now. Can we utilize this to put this in place to give us some indication of where we need to individualize programs to target programming? And so that natural transition came about probably over like a surveillance period of getting my feet under the table within the sport, understanding how I can assist the team in that angle, taking what I'd learned with judo and other elite sports around the EIS stuff, and then being able to put that in place in a football environment, which isn't really something that likes to change. And so I think 3 years was a great way of getting to the point where I started to influence that and took responsibility for putting that process in place and led on that. But then it took another 3 years for us to really see the fruits of that. Soft tissue injuries going down by 35% over a 3-year period, which, again, they started a little bit high, but making that sort of impact was about all of those other bits we've talked about, bringing everybody on board, and then using that information regularly to solve the problem, including educating players, coaches. Yeah, so much more to it than just what you choose to measure. It's about how you catch it, how you filter it, and how you put it in place.
Yeah, well, you mentioned right at the start about it being such a different environment going in. What are the things within that environment? Is it easy to name what the differences are?
I think it's so multifactorial. And I think the challenges, if I talk more generally, the challenges are sometimes you've got individuals with big medical histories of injury, right? And that creates a cascade of problems where you kind of push things around the body in general terms. I think there's a reluctance to, or there was a reluctance back then to actually look at proper strength training. And I would say the changes and transition over the time, the 6 years I was there, in terms of not just the first team, but the academy, were to move towards bringing in people who could influence strength and conditioning. Not just running numbers, and volumes and what can you do on the pitch, but what can we do to prepare the athletes for that? And that was the most significant change whilst I was there. That was probably what changed a lot of the individuals that were getting injured, is improving strength and power and being able to find a good way of monitoring it, but also being able to put that into a weekly program at the right time, right place, to make sure that you develop athletes. Des Ryan in the academy at the time was a huge addition to change how Arsenal prepared the young players for going into the first team, and they're reaping still the benefits of that now. But also bringing in someone like Shad Forsyth, who's friends with Darcy Norman, to come in and head up strength and conditioning, bringing in Barry Solon with him. So suddenly there's now more coaches delivering proper strength work in the gym with athletes to dovetail and prepare them for what they need to do on the pitch.
Yeah, and then because you've done your masters in S&C as well, haven't you? Were you doing that at the same time?
Yeah, so that was 2011. I started that with a view to actually trying to differentiate myself to get in the shop window for jobs that might be like the Arsenal job. And I think that's one of the other interesting things that I had as a string to my bow. They saw that strength and conditioning angle, and I don't want to dig into it too much, but essentially myself and my colleague would take players and do loading with players that we felt needed extra loading. And we, as physios who had strength and conditioning qualifications, were delivering strength and conditioning for players at that time point. And that transition was then, okay, now, and it was always the intention, I'm sure, but to bring in people who could actually influence that, who were experts in the field. But for a time, we were delivering that ourselves around some, common areas and well within scope of practice. But we'd be looking at hamstring strength. We'd be looking at, just normal like squat patterns and loading them up. Just looking at, jump heights and power, and we had good force platforms, so we could start to look at data on players and be a bit more granular about what they might need in their program. That at the time wasn't something that was taking place across the whole team.
So how big an impact did it have on you and your development doing the masters in S&C?
Massive. I would say still, I wouldn't be able to put in if a job came up in the NFL as head strength coach, I wouldn't be qualified for that, right? I've got enough of an understanding now to be able to manage a team where I had good strength coaches in the team and have a good conversation with them and actually challenge them about what they're delivering. So it's given me that broader understanding about the whole spectrum of, from injury to performance, so health and performance spectrum. I've got a much better understanding of that performance end than I ever had before I did the strength and conditioning masters. And then it was also at the time I did my UKSCA. So the actual feeling it, doing it, and then teaching it was really important to understand loading. I'd done my own training in my life, but I'd hardly lifted a weight. So actually to have to go through that process of the practical aspects of learning to sprint, learning to load, learning to do all these things in the gym, and then be able to then teach that in the right way to people was the practical aspects of that course, and how they prepared you for that at St Mary's in Twickenham were fantastic.
Yeah, and so how does the dynamic normally work then with when you've got like the S&C side combined with the medical person? Well, it's probably all under the umbrella of medical.
It really depends. So I think if you've got more strings to your bow, you can take it further along the spectrum. And if you're a one-man band, there's a few good colleagues who now work as a one-man band with a Formula One racing driver or a tennis player. And because they've got this breadth of knowledge, they can deliver across everything: conditioning, strength, treatment, diagnosis. But when you come into an organization, there's a set of roles and responsibilities, and there's stuff that you're being measured on and you're accountable for. And I think as long as you set that up, there will always be blurry edges to the black and white lines that you can draw. But over time, you build up an understanding of who becomes responsible, and you work together within your strength. So I might be a physio that can take people a little bit further down the spectrum rather than just focusing on mobility and activation. I'll probably be doing stuff around loading, measuring strength, force, peak power, etc. That's because I can, and I've got that experience. In another realm, it might be that you bring in an S&C coach who's really experienced, someone like a Ben Rosenblatt, who's worked in an injury setting for a long period of time in rehab, so really understands the injury end of the spectrum, or a Shad Forsyth who did his athletic training, so he has that injury knowledge as well, so he can work a little bit back closer to diagnosis. And it just depends on your skill mix and skill set within the team, and also how many people, how big's your team. If you're a one-man band, you got to do everything. But if you've got expertise, use the expertise that's around you. Yeah.
Yeah. And then so how easy was it for you to say that you don't want to be at Arsenal anymore, or you were looking for other things then? Because it sounds like you enjoyed that aspect of it.
It was a brilliant 6 years, and it came to a conclusion around the time when Arsene Wenger left. So I had an opportunity, and I'd always wanted to sort of push myself further, but I had an opportunity to take some time to decide what I wanted to do next. And I basically looked to try and set up my own business at the time, started a PhD, and I was fully determined on setting up the athletic shoulder business from that time point going forward, and wanted to work for myself. And I enjoyed a really nice midlife retirement for about 6 months, maybe even 9 months, before I was contacted by one of the Arsenal players who'd become a sporting director in Prague, so Thomas Rosicky. And he asked me, did I know anybody who could come and do a head of performance role in Sparta and help them out? So I gave him 3 candidates. Conversations went further, and then they wanted to know what the package was and the opportunity, and we had that discussion, and I asked my wife, and I was on a plane, and then I was signing a contract, and I was out there in a couple of months in March 2019. So the 9-month setting up my own business and midlife retirement had gone really well. I'd spent some time with the family after probably years of work-life balance not being very good at all. But I was hungry to start something else, and this opportunity just came at the right time. And so I ended up in Prague for 3 years, until last May, as director of performance for Sparta Prague.
Yeah, what was that like then, living? I presume, how often did you live there then?
I lived there, so I was full-time living there, bouncing back to the UK whenever I could. 3 seasons, across 4 seasons, but 3 full seasons with that team through COVID. And so I was, enjoying a different challenge. It was so different to being a first team physio working in a team. I was now in charge of and working on a team, which again got me out of bed in the morning. It was a brilliant challenge working with Thomas, who was fantastic as a boss, and also trying to develop people, facilities, processes in a place where they needed a lot of development and influence. So again, that 3-year journey was a brilliant challenge.
What was that like then, being over there for COVID? That must have been tricky.
Yeah, look, it was hard. I was living away from family. So at that point, I spent 6 months away from family, and I saw my daughter for 6 days out of those 6 months. So that probably accelerated my willingness to get back home. If that job was down the road, I might still be doing it. In fact, I'm pretty much sure I would be doing it, because it was a fantastic opportunity, and we'd started to put some really good things in place. However, it probably came at a good point, because I'd done that job. I felt like I'd had a good influence, a good impact, and then it was time to actually properly get stuck into setting up my own business. So I came back, decompressed, and basically hooked up with all of the connections I've been able to make over the preceding sort of 10 years. And I started to say, look, now I'm open for business. It's Athletic Shoulders. You know, do you want me? Let's have a good conversation about how I can help and support individuals, teams, organizations, and then how can I share some of the stuff that I've developed over the last sort of 10, 15 years.
So what's your mission statement or your main driver for this then? Who are the people you want to be working with?
Well, the real vision is just it's on my whiteboard, so I'm turning to the right. It's doing great work with the best people or organizations to solve athletic shoulder problems, right? So that's what I want to do, and that incorporates a lot of stuff. I want to work with good people, and I've been very fortunate through working for others to work with good people. And now people that contact me, what I'm seeing is these are some of like the world's leading organizations who are interested in solving these athletic shoulder problems. So Major League Baseball teams, the NFL, rugby teams, you know, worldwide. All of these people are the kind of teams that I'm working with. And that's the sort of consultation with teams part of the business. Then there's the individual rehab. So we're setting up something different, which is, you know, a higher level service for people who've got high shoulder demands. We set that up from London. There's 2 of us working together from this month, and we're providing this outcome-driven approach to shoulders where physios can bring in their athletes, clients, get an opinion, get a program, get a profile, get some information on what they should be doing, and then they implement that process themselves often. And then we monitor that and track that with them. So we're supporting others, and that's, I think, the main thing around the role. And those 2 parts of the business are then supported by the online learning and the in-person learning. So learning is a key component of what I'm trying to offer as well, and trying to teach and share and offer an opportunity for people to explore aspects of athletic shoulders that maybe they haven't delved into within their own training and development.
And how have you found it doing your own thing as opposed to being employed?
Fantastic. You and Joe, we talked off air before, but I think we both had a busy first quarter of this year, and it's a couple of things. It's you work as hard as you need to work. You're responsible for your own destiny. You choose who you work with often, right? And that in itself, plus the diversity of the kind of people I've been working with, so elite level circus performers, the military, Major League Baseball, and that's just in the early part of this year. So it sort of passed me by until March, and now I'm busy setting up kind of the next phase so that I can make sure that we're able to support all those different aspects of the business.
Yeah, no, it does sound amazing. And then for what do you see as the future then for you? What, more of the same or what?
Yeah. So, I mean, we've released this online course. So Alex Wolf and I are learning resources and online stuff. We've done that. We put that out there in February. Going to release more courses. I've got a partnership agreement with Valve now. So there will be a testing course that we release in the middle of this year. And subsequent to that, it's then collaborating with people. So there will be courses around shoulder isometric training, the tennis shoulder, the throwing shoulder, a rehab level 2 course. And that's the idea, to keep those consistently building and growing over the next couple of years from a learning and development perspective. But in London, it's building a team. So at the moment, there's myself and Gus Morrison. But the idea is to reach out to people who are interested in shoulders, who want to come and help. And, you know, I mentored Gus 7 years ago, and now he's a colleague. And he reached out to me, and I trust him, and I've worked with him over that period of time. And that's doing good work with good people, grow the business, bring on a few more people, and be able to deliver this service as Athletic Shoulders to add value to clients, whether it's individuals or teams.
No, it sounds great. But you're obviously a studious person. You've got loads of qualifications. Like, do you into your own non-clinical personal development and like reading books?
I am, yes. So I recommended Atomic Habits to someone the other day, James Clear. That's been a real great book at the right time for me. That was about, I always thought I was driven, and then my drive was sort of running out. And it's like, well, that's normal. You can't be driven every day. So if you set up habits, then you don't have to rely on personal drive all the time. You just because you're consistent. So that was a great lesson from that book. I'm a sort of dip in and dip out of podcasts and books. After the first half of the first quarter of this year, I was mentally smashed. So now I probably don't listen to a podcast on a dog walk. I just go for a dog walk. But there will be a time when I start to dip back in and get a bit more excited and start to read again, start to listen to rather than talk on podcasts and do my own podcasts.
There's so much content, which is really good, but then it is overwhelming, isn't it? Whether it's audio books, podcasts, reading books itself, it is difficult to know, and there's so many options of things as well.
Right time, right place. There's some podcasts I go back and listen to over and over again, and there's probably some podcasts out there that I would do that I'm not aware of. And that's the thing. It's quite I wouldn't say it's overly saturated, but the ones that have continued after lockdown and the ones that are still going obviously have got a good following, and there's a lot of really good insights that aren't necessarily technical. I think like this conversation now, I haven't had this sort of conversation with people before. It's often been around a technical remit or around shoulders specifically. This is more about the journey, and I think sometimes people are really glad to know about that sort of stuff too.
Yeah, but no, that's what fascinates me, because it's like everyone that I've had on, they've all had very similar in some respects, but then a different philosophy, or even though it's the same, it's been quite different, which is I always find really interesting. Last question.
Yeah.
So you've done loads of amazing things. Are there any particular ones that stand out as being absolutely memorable experiences?
Well, I think the British Judo, the end of the British Judo 3 years, I still maintain that's my best job from a personal development point of view. But also the fact that I was very involved, and probably involved with the athletes that were, that I was trying to help. And so we got to that event, and British Judo is not a world power, and it wasn't a world power, and it always struggles because of numbers. But there were 2 medals at the Olympic Games. And in the Paralympic Games, the thing that stands out to me the most, so firstly, Gemma Gibbons won the Olympic silver medal, having had a shoulder labral repair 9 months before, which is just incredible. And she actually broke her hand on the day in her second fight. So the relationship I had with her essentially was a great one. She succeeded way above all odds. So that was one of the fantastic moments, just being able to see that and her achievements. The second one was Ben Quilter, who was a Paralympic judo player, and he'd ruptured his ACL 50 days before, and MCL 50 days before the Paralympics. And so we put in place a ridiculously aggressive program, knowing that we couldn't do anything operatively. And he got back on the mat and he actually won a Paralympic bronze medal, having ruptured his ACL. And the experience there was, here's the team that we're working with. What can we do to help support this guy get there? He's about to retire. It's his last games. How can we give him the opportunity? But the other thing was the network that I had. We could reach out to people like Lee Harrington, who'd worked with a Taekwondo player with a similar problem in the EIS. And so we brought Lee down to help us with this player because he was the expert with knowledge. So that whole picture, the doc we were working with, the consultant that was on speed dial, Andy Williams, for British Judo's knees, literally was a quick call. Can you do anything? Not really. We'd have to immobilize it for too long for you to make it. Okay, great, thanks. Next, what can we do? And it was just the whole team approach to get him there. The physio with the Paralympic team doing the work. Paul Thorley, who came in and did some stuff with knee rehab. That collaboration and the success of getting that guy to Paralympic bronze against all odds was the best moment, not because I feel it was down to me, but to see everybody who pulled together to help that guy achieve. And ultimately, that's the way I look at it. We're just giving them the opportunity. They're the ones that win things. So that was a key success.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. How did he manage to do that then?
Well, firstly, his training partners gave him the injury. We looked at a lot of things. We used blood flow restriction training. We used PRP injections. We pushed things much, much harder than we would ever have done it. We immobilized for as long as we could. We got a really decent dynamic brace very early on. As I say, we brought Lee Harrington in. We had Paul Thorley, who's a knee expert. Everything in there. But basically, the guy just trusted us because we had that relationship, and we said, let's go. Like, there's no other way of doing this. This is your retirement. This is the last chance. Let's just go for it. And I think that was after 2 days of like giving him a hug and feeling sorry for him and him feeling sorry for himself. We all went, right, let's crack on. And 48 days later, he managed to do almost the impossible.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect place to finish on. So I'll keep my talking to a minimum. But Ben, I've really enjoyed that. So thank you for sharing your stories. Very excited to see how you get on with the new projects that you're working on. And I hope to catch up with you soon.
Thanks a lot, mate. It's been a real pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Cheers. Yeah, and good luck with the podcast later.
Thanks, mate. Thanks.
Cheers, mate.